Government spending is out of control, and the only option Congress is probably considering is cutting programs like Social Security, SNAP, and Medicare. Now, I want you guys to hear it straight from billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller. Check this out.
I was actually happy to see when the announcement, the support for Ukraine and Israel, $106 billion, and I was waiting to hear what the offset was going to be. Was it going to be entitlements? Where were the cuts going to be? And the next thing I knew, 2 days later, there was not only no offset, there was $56 trillion in emergency spending. I have kids, I have grandkids. Child care is not emergency spending. It's a priority that maybe should be on the table or not, but we are spending like drunken sailors, okay? So
do you agree with the House Republican plan, which puts forth spending for Israel but cuts it in the IRA through funding to the IRS? Is that an appropriate offset in your mind?
Becky, I want to go after entitlements. It's right. where the money is, and
you're not going to solve this.
At some point, it's going to happen. I'm going to give you some numbers to tell you why.
Do that. Yeah.
It's going to happen no matter what.
Well, you guys heard it straight from Stanley Druckenmiller. So, guys, I, as an average person, we saw interest rates go so low. I refinanced my car, my rental properties to a much lower rate in order to save money. And these government officials making big bucks didn't realize that. Or maybe they just don't give a rat's behind about saving money for the American people. Maybe it's as simple as that, guys. Now, like you heard, Stanley Druckenmiller has said that the federal government has been spending recklessly and failed to issue debt at low rates in the past years. Mistakes that will ultimately lead to some tough choices in the future, more than likely like cutting Social Security. And he mentions that the White House trying to get another $56 billion in emergency spending for disaster relief, child care programs, in addition to the $106 billion that the administration wants for Israel and for the Ukraine in order to offset the runaway spending. Now, Druckenmiller said government entitlement programs, which make up almost half of the federal budget, could be pared down in the future. More specifically, he proposed a cut in Social Security benefits. And his argument, this generation has got to take a cut. Right now, current seniors, you're going to get 100 cents on the dollar. Future seniors, looking at 5 or 10 cents on the dollar, is it not unreasonable for us to go to 85 or 90 cents on the dollar? So, I bet our Social Security fan watching right now definitely has something to say about that. You guys let me know in the comment section down below. And as a result, Stanley Druckenmiller believes that the market will be very challenged in the current environment and only disciplined stock pickers will be rewarded. I just want to point out something. I've been thinking about this lately. And, have any of you guys actually noticed that every time that there's a huge economic recession or depression that we end up going to war? Is it just a coincidence? I'm gonna let you guys go ahead and answer that. So, and also just to make sure you guys stay updated, hit the subscribe button and also drop a like for the video. I really appreciate the support, you guys. And if you own a home, make sure your home is protected. Get your free home warranty quote. There's a link in the description down below this video. It only takes like 10 seconds. All right. So another critic of government spending is Senator Rand Paul. His warning to everyone who will listen: the government's out of control spending is threatening the very existence of the US dollar and even the country. According to Senator Paul, they'll bankrupt our country and sending money everywhere else all over the planet. I think some of our viewers can definitely agree with that, right? He also mentioned how this is probably the greatest threat to our national security. If that's what we are thinking that we're supposed to do to protect our national security, this may be a failed plan. The greatest threat to it is our national debt. Pay attention to guys. Now, we borrowed $1 trillion in just the past 3 months. That's a lot of money, guys. Hence, out of control government spending. And as Senator Paul put it, we are threatening the very existence of our currency and perhaps even our country. So what do you guys think about this? Like, do you think Senator Paul is onto something here? Are we literally putting our national security at risk because of this out of control government spending? Now, another notable person sounding the alarm is, as well as Senator Rand Paul, J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, billionaire bond king Jeffrey Gundlach, and well-known investor Jim Rogers. So J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon recently said he's worried about the U.S. economy because the fiscal money being spent is so big, the largest in peacetime ever, with very high deficits and QT we've never had. He also warned about how we could possibly be in the most dangerous time in the world as seen in decades. Definitely feels that way to me. Now, last month, billionaire bond king Jeffrey Gundlach, he said that the future of the U.S. dollar and possibly out of control inflation depends on getting the budget and spending under control. Economist and gold bug Peter Schiff, he predicted a full-blown financial crisis and a U.S. dollar crisis as the national debt spirals out of control. Then, of course, there's the financial services firm Jefferies talking about the potential collapse of the U.S. dollar. And of course, let's not forget very famous investor Jim Rogers. He warned that the era of the U.S. dollar dominance is ending with the Chinese yuan as the sole contender to replace the USD. Not a good look, guys. All big names in the finance world are saying the exact same thing, that we got to get this government control. We got to get this government spending under control. Now, as the U.S., as the United States citizens, we, the people, we have the right to know what's going on, right? I mean, U.S. national debt sitting at beyond $33 trillion. Now, according to OECD data, as a percentage of debt to GDP, the country with the highest level of debt, national debt in 2022 was Japan, sitting at 255%. The United States ranked fourth behind Greece and Italy. And just to kind of really bring it home for you guys, every year since 2001, the U.S. government has spent more money than it takes in, which means it has to borrow more money in order to make up the difference. They say that debt has many useful purposes. The public debt has always been used for emergencies. It's easier to finance by borrowing than to burden the current generation with taxes. So, does this mean that we've been in an emergency since like 2001? I'm going to let you guys think about that one for a second. But more recently, the national debt increased by more than 89% since the beginning of the pandemic, with many top economists in agreement that 2020 was not the time to worry about the debt. But now that the worst of the public health emergency has passed, the focus is back on how the ever-expanding debt can be harmful to the economy. The national debt experts make a very good point here. Their concern is not whether the national debt should ever be used. It should be how it is used and how much it is used. And unfortunately, we're using it for rainy days, and right now we have sunny days. So in other words, they're using it at a time where we shouldn't be using it. And economists measure the severity of a nation's debt based on the debt to GDP ratio. The U.S. debt held by the public is nearly at 100%. The Committee for Economic Development for the Conference Board says a responsible debt to GDP ratio for a country the size of the United States would be like 70%. See what I mean? Now, debt helps the economy because you can take on large initiatives like infrastructure. You can take on crises like the pandemic. But like the experts are saying, you have to watch where the debt to GDP ratio is, because that really is the stability indicator of whether you can actually service the debt or whether you're just simply tilting the balance. Especially now, servicing the debt can become difficult when interest rates are higher. And the Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rates ever since March of 2022, with the goal of slowing down the economic activity and also lowering inflation. Now, some were making the most of it, saying that servicing the debt at a high interest rate can actually stimulate the economy. Basically, the Fed is pushing up interest rates, and this is feeding hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in additional income to bondholders. So people who are holding the government bonds, paying higher rates of interest, they're getting a huge windfall in the form of interest income. And that income can be spent just like any other form of income. So basically, they're pimping out the government. Now, debt rises when the U.S. spends more than it earns from taxes and other revenue. The public debt results from tax and spending policies that currently garner public support, but individuals often worry about how the national debt affects their lives and their finances. So really, guys, what does the national debt mean for you and for average Americans? That's the real question. Now, again, the federal government, they are running a budget deficit whenever spending exceeds tax collections and other revenue. It's kind of like, you're running a personal budget deficit if you make 80 grand a year, but you're spending $100,000 a year. It's pretty much what the government's doing right now. And you're putting that extra $20,000 that you're spending on a credit card that at some point in time down the road, you have to pay it back. Now, again, to make up the difference, the U.S. Treasury sells Treasury bills, which we can't do. We can't sell Treasury bills or notes or bonds. The national debt is the combination of the federal government's annual budget deficits minus the surpluses. Now, when you look at U.S. history, the debt to GDP ratio tends to rise during recessions and in their aftermath. The GDP shrinks during a recession while government tax receipts go down and safety net spending rises. So the combination of higher budget deficits and lower GDP inflates the debt to GDP ratio. When you go through like these deep recessions, like the ones that we saw in the 1980s, and then of course, in the 2008 through 2009, they can have some pretty serious and lasting effects on the national debt. I mean, we saw some of the most massive debt spending and significant historical events in the United States, like overseas borrowing in order to finance the American Revolution, tax cuts and spending increases advocated by President Ronald Reagan grew the debt to GDP ratio to 52% in 1990. Then, of course, you had the fallout from the Great Recession, saw the debt to GDP ratio rise from 64% in 2008 to 100% by 2012. And most recently, response to the C-19 or COVID-19 pandemic raised the debt to GDP ratio to 107% in late 2019. By 135% by mid-2020, it declined to 119% as of Q1 of 2023. So the question is, how does the debt affect you, right? People often compare government debt to personal debt in order to express their concerns about its size. Now, I did that just now just to explain, just to give you a better understanding of how debt works. But there's a crucial difference. A family can't print their own money like the U.S. government can. Just like I said earlier, we can't print bonds, which is debt, more currency, notes, which is debt. We can't do that like the government can. But really, what really matters isn't just how much debt we have or how it compares to our country's GDP. What really matters is how we use that borrowed money. Now, let's talk about the paradox of thrift, right? Now, sometimes when people try to save more money individually, it actually has the opposite effect when you look at the bigger picture. It's not a paradox to understand why governments, when they adapt fiscal austerity and cut spending, can end up causing more significant economic downturns, leading to even bigger deficits and ultimately even more debt. Now, dealing with debt and the costs of servicing that debt, it forces policymakers to make some tough choices. And remember, how we use the money that we borrow can be more important than the amount of debt that we take on or how it compares to our country's GDP. So, for instance, during the C-19 crisis, many Americans supported government spending for pandemic relief while opposing cuts to expensive government programs. They also feel like they're paying too much in federal income taxes, but are increasingly open to raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy. And when the government borrows money and invests it in ways that boost the economy's potential, it could pay off in the long run, or it might not. Really, it's all about, again, how the money is put to use. There's also such a thing as modern monetary theory. Basically, it means that the government The governments don't rely on taxes or borrowing for spending money that they can print as much as they need. You know, there are economists, even those who believe in this theory, who point out that the amount of debt held by the United States government doesn't always mirror the savings choices of the investors buying the government bonds. This includes central banks from countries that have trade surpluses with the United States, as well as U.S. corporations and households. National debt, you see, often gets people kind of riled up in the political space, particularly when it starts to approach the congressional set debt ceiling, which is going to happen in just a few days, by the way. It's a real nail biter for politicians and financial markets because they have to grapple with the scary thought of the U.S. possibly defaulting on its debt if the debt ceiling isn't increased. Definitely something to pick up on the future updates, guys. Make sure you tune in. If you made it this far in the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'm going to see you guys on the next one. Take care.